Hello, my name is Ellen Goudsmit. I'm a chartered health psychologist and I specialise in ME as defined by Ramsey as well as chronic fatigue syndrome. I tend to separate the two because I'm not yet persuaded that the two conditions are the same. There's an assumption of equivalence, and I think after about 10 years it's time to test that assumption, which is why I've helped to develop some criteria for ME and why I'm now studying ME and comparing it with chronic fatigue syndrome and other conditions. I was involved in the submission of the report during the drafting of the NICE guidelines. We found a number of factual errors which we alerted NICE to, and we were very disappointed to find when we saw the report that most of those errors were still in the guidelines. The result of the failure to correct the errors and to include what we considered were clinically significant omissions is that a completely different approach to CBT and graded exercise therapy, or GET, was ignored. And this limits psychologists to what we're able to offer patients. We are not able to offer tailor-made, individualized programs which will help them, which they may prefer, which are more appropriate, which are more effective. We are limited basically to one approach because the recommendations advocate CBT, GET, and something called activity management, all of which are based on the CBT model, which posits that the symptoms are exacerbated or perpetuated by physical deconditioning, or as we call it, lack of physical fitness, and misguided beliefs which lead people to avoid activities which they are capable of doing. The model also tends to assume that any physiological abnormalities are due to the effects of stress and inactivity, and therefore it excludes a whole body of evidence indicating that the population diagnosed with CFS is made out of subgroups, and some of these subgroups do have evidence of ongoing disease, and for them graded exercise would not be appropriate. There are also a lot of patients who are not avoiding activity, they're still working. Indeed, if you look at the studies which have been used, quite a proportion of the subjects were still working at least part-time. And there's no actual evidence of a relationship between physical deconditioning and the symptoms of CFS. If anybody wants to look that up, there's a study by Baselmans et al., which you will find if you Google it. Scientists are human. We all have our biases. It isn't a problem if somebody prefers one explanation or another. But when you're part of a group like the GDG, you have to put those biases aside and you have to be objective and dispassionate. You look at all the evidence, and if somebody with expertise points out that you're missing certain information or that certain data are incorrect and that you're drawing the wrong conclusions, you should take note. And certainly in the past, when I've been part of the consultation process, I've only had to alert people to something which was misleading and it was amended. This time, virtually nothing that I pointed out was amended. I'll give you some examples of these. The first problem is my own study. It was included in the review by the CRD at York as far back as 2001, which was interesting because it was a pilot study, and it's very unusual for pilot studies to end up in these kind of reviews. They're usually RCTs. Pilots tend to be smaller studies, the samples are smaller, they don't have things like intention to treat analysis. What they're there to do is to find out if there are any major problems with measures, and to work out how many subjects that a study would need to get a certain minimal reliable effect. So I was very chuffed to be included, but some of the information was wrong. So I emailed, I even phoned the CRD and found out why they'd made certain decisions about my study. And the first error, which was repeated in the draft of the NICE guidelines, relates to self-efficacy. Now, self-efficacy is important because we believe that much of the improvement that we've seen with the CBT trials is because of the improvements in self-efficacy. That is, people are given enough information to make them feel more confident that they're able to do what's needed to improve. It's about confidence. It's about feeling that you get more control over your illness. In the draft consultation, the difference between the treated group and the waiting list controls was 0.013. However, in the draft, it was 0.13. 0.13 is not significant. 0.03 is very significant. Now, the criteria for inclusion of a treatment is, as far as I know, that you need at least 2 studies showing an improvement between a treated group and a control group. I thought at the time was on 2 outcome measures, but I believe now that's been changed to 1 outcome measure. The other criteria is a significant improvement within the treated group. But at the time, as far as I was concerned, and from talking to the CRD, I and others needed to show a significant difference between the treated group and the control group on 2 clinically significant outcome measures. Self-efficacy, in my mind, is clinically significant. They admitted that there was a significant difference between the 2 groups for fatigue and for somatic symptoms. So we've got 3 significant differences. But they decided that there were no significant differences for anxiety and depression. Now, when I did my study, I found that I had an outlier on one of the measures. What that means is that you have a cluster of scores which are there, and then there's one score which is far away. And what you do, well, you can do a number of things, but what was the thing to do then, when I did the analysis, was to transform the data so you move the outlier closer to the other scores. This means that it's not misleading because you're recognizing that there was one abnormal score, but you're not going to distort the whole set of results because that outlier has dragged the cluster, the average, down too much. So I transformed the data and I still had a significant difference that was not recognized. And I phoned the CRD and they said, well, you transformed the data, so we're not taking the transformed data into account. Now you think, okay, that's fine, except that in the study by Deal, which achieved the highest validity scores, they completely ignored the fact that Deal et al. Transformed all their data.